When you think about it, the progress we've made in medicine since 1900 is just staggering. We have vaccines, antibiotics, and treatments that would have seemed like pure magic just a few generations ago. And yet, disease is still this stubborn, devastating force in our world. So, we're living in this weird paradox of medical marvels and persistent suffering. Let's dig into why that is. So that's the big question, right? How can we know so much, have all these incredible tools at our disposal, and still, in so many ways, feel like we're losing the fight? Well, as you're about to see, the answer has just as much to do with our society as it does with our science. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at what's called the poverty disease trap. Then, we'll talk about the surprising role of pandemics. After that, we'll get into the new challenges that come from our own success, from living longer. And finally, we'll uncover what might be the biggest hurdle of all. Okay, let's dive right into our first big topic, the poverty disease trap. This is all about a really stark reminder. A brilliant cure doesn't mean a thing if it can't get to the people who actually need it. I mean, just look at malaria. We have treatments, we have simple, effective tools like mosquito nets to prevent it, and yet hundreds of thousands of people, mostly young children in sub-Saharan Africa, die from it every single year. It is just this perfect and, frankly, tragic example of the gap between what we know and what we can actually do. And it's so easy to think, oh, it's just about money. But it's way more complicated than that. Just try to picture it. How do you keep vaccines refrigerated? That's the cold chain, in a remote village where the power is spotty at best. Or how do you run a public health campaign in the middle of a war zone? It's this whole tangled web of economics, politics, and social barriers that stand between a cure and a patient. Now get this. This is absolutely mind-blowing. We developed a cure for tuberculosis, a really deadly lung disease, way back in the 19th century. And yet, here we are today, and it's still a major killer. It's almost hard to wrap your head around, right? A curable disease is still thriving, not because we failed at the science, but because we failed at getting the cure to people. Medical breakthroughs alone are not enough. And then you see a number like this, around 95,000 deaths a year from cholera. This isn't some new mysterious virus we're fighting. It's a bacterial infection spread by contaminated water. The fix isn't some crazy high-tech drug. It's basic stuff we take for granted. Clean water, good sanitation. This really drives home how critical those basic environmental and social factors are. Okay, let's shift gears to our second section, pandemics. They're these huge destructive events, obviously, but they also have this weird two-sided nature. They're like these giant stress tests that expose all our weaknesses, but also force us to get better, to innovate. So this timeline just gives you a quick snapshot of the big global outbreaks we're going to touch on. Each one, in its own awful way, taught us something important and pretty much changed the game for public health. Wow, that number, 50 million, it's almost impossible to really grasp that scale. And a huge reason it spread so fast? Well, the world was getting smaller. More travel, more trade. It basically acted like a superhighway for the virus. And back then, there really wasn't much medical science could do. Okay, let's jump ahead to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And this quote, it really hits on a dark and frankly shameful part of the story. Because the disease was first associated with marginalized communities, the response from public health officials and researchers was tragically slow. It's just this brutal reminder of how social prejudice can literally stand in the way of saving lives. But then, science delivered in a huge way. Incredible treatments were developed that turned what was a death sentence into a manageable condition. But here's the other side of that coin. Those life-saving drugs are expensive. So in poorer communities, AIDS is still an absolute catastrophe. It's the same story, right? Incredible science, but persistent, heartbreaking inequality. And of course, that brings us to COVID-19, something we all have fresh in our minds. We all saw this paradox play out in real time, didn't we? On the one hand, it ripped the cover off of these deep divides and inequalities in our societies. But on the other hand, we witnessed this unbelievable global scientific effort that gave us vaccines at a speed nobody thought was possible. All right, so what happens when we actually start winning some of these fights against infectious diseases? Well, we live longer. And that brings us to our third big challenge, the diseases that show up as a direct result of that very success. I love this phrase, a consequence of success. It perfectly sums up this paradox. By solving the problems that used to kill us young, we'd basically earned the privilege of facing a whole new set of health problems, the chronic illnesses and diseases that come with aging, like heart disease or dementia. And Alzheimer's is probably one of the most devastating examples of this. It's just such a cruel disease, slowly taking away a person's memories, their identity, and the strain it puts on everyone, the patients, their families, the entire healthcare system, is just immense. It's truly one of the biggest health challenges for our aging societies. So, with no cure on the horizon just yet, the whole approach to fighting a disease like Alzheimer's has to change. The goalposts move. It becomes less about a cure and more about management. How can we diagnose it earlier? How can we provide better, more supportive care? And, so critically, how do we support the caregivers who are on the front lines of this every single day? It becomes about quality of life, which is a totally different battle than fighting off a virus. Okay, so let's tie all these threads together. We've looked at poverty, we've looked at pandemics, we've looked at the challenges of living longer. So, what's the one thing that connects all of these stories? Well, it really comes down to this: the equity gap. It's this gap, this persistent, frustrating gap, between the amazing scientific tools we create and our ability to get them to every single person who needs them, no matter where they live or how much money they have. And all of this leaves us with one final, really big question to think about. What's next? It's not just about what the next miracle drug will be. It's also about what societal advancements we need to make. Because if there's one thing we've seen today, it's that you can't separate the science from the society it lives in. Tackling disease is about so much more than what happens in a lab. It's about building a fairer, more equitable world.